I'd like to invite the third speaker. It's Michèle Bokobza Kahan. He's Professor of French Culture and Literature at Tel Aviv University in the French Department. A PhD thesis was approved by University of Sorbonne, Paris 3, and Tel Aviv University, summa cum laude, in 1999. Her research activities and subjects of investigation are on French literature and culture of the 18th century, narrative theories and a novel of the Enlightenment, libertine literature, sex and philosophy, clandestine literature, and the notion of marginality, subversive religious conflicts and testimony in the 18th century. She is the author of Libertinage et folie dans les romans du XVIIIe siècle et du Lorrain et son œuvre, un auteur marginal, déviance discursive et bigarrure philosophique. She has published various articles on religious testimonial discourses about miracles and convulsions that occurred in early 18th century Paris. Her work highlights topics on testimony, discourses, and rhetorical and pragmatic strategies, as well as confrontations between testimony, politics, and religion, and public opinion. Please welcome her.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I must admit that the corpus I will present here is connected to issues related to testimonial discourses and less to trauma, but the predominant place accorded to pains and sufferings raises many questions linked with our preoccupations here. I want also to say something that I said already after a CB lecture, that we haven't pronounced so often during these days a word, and it was quite surprising me because I think it is a key word, both for scholars coming from humanities field and from medical health field, and I mean the word communication. So I hope that this lecture too will bring back this little absence into our debates. So the early 18th century constitutes a turning point in the cultural history of the Western world. After nearly 150 years of religious controversies and the arousal of strong suspicion regarding the credibility of history and its capacity to reconstruct the reality of the past, tensions between the individual and institutional, religious, economic, political, social frameworks complicated conventional hierarchical relationships. In the literary field, the shift from memoir, memories, to autobiographical practice, as well as a huge number of novels written in the first person, indicated the growing need for individual and intimate investigation of the subject. Similar evolutions in terms of functions, characteristics, strategies, and issues occur as well in the status of the witness and the testimony he or she bears. Such evolution conducts to new challenges for testimonial practices, especially when the testimony is connected to political conflicts of power. If we take, for example, the testimonies of miraculous healings performed after the death of the janseniste François de Paris, you don't know him, but it's okay, you don't have to. But so he was buried at the age of 37 in the community of Saint-Médard in the middle of Paris in 1727. We do not see at first glance any difference between them and similar events reported in irregular intervals throughout the medieval and early modern period. But a deeper look reveals a totally different picture. Due to an unusual combination of circumstances, the cures attributed to François de Paris were drawn into the stormy arena of contemporary ecclesiastical politics. As such, they constitute a turning point not only in terms of historical approaches devoted to the history of religions and ideas, but also of literary and testimonial practices because of the specific material involved and its significance. These testimonies are innovative in terms of language and communication. New discursive strategies are used in order to gain legitimacy and recognition as an authentic rendition of events. Therefore, they function as an instrument of persuasion, and they must be considered as a political matter because they participate in the processes of building a new collective identity in terms of social, juridical, and moral orders. The contents of these testimonies have been studied and described in several important books written by historians of religions and ideas. They have been considered more as documents than as innovative testimonial discourses. Furthermore, the historians of the religions didn't notice that one of the most exceptional characteristics of these testimonial discourses is the detailed and redundant descriptions of the suffering body and the traumatic experiences of the illnesses and injuries that destroy the body. The descriptions relate indeed how the tissues of the body are blown up by terrible events and all lines of physical defenses are smashed and destroyed, leaving the victim in a total helpless state. Why does this text focus on what we call today a traumatic event? Is it just in order to glorify the greatness of the divine miracle, or in the contrary, to give voice to the disempowered, or eventually to combine the both? Does this phenomenon traces the past to psychic concepts interlinked with physical symptoms connected to mental disturbance, such as consciousness of the self, truth and falseness of the memory, compulsive repetitive schemes of actions, and how can we explain the accumulation of hundreds of testimonies of this kind related to the miracles of Samedar? In what degree can we connect the traumatic contents with the political issues of these very particular testimonies? In this paper, I shall argue that the accumulation of hundreds of testimonies related to the traumatic experiences of physical injuries and the miraculous healings of Samedar enables us, probably for the first time, to see how testimonies not only result from an event, but in many ways create, modulate, and transform it into a conveyor of much wider issues. Also, it was not conceptualized at that time the assertion of a bridge existing between the individual and his testimonial practices on one hand, and larger social realities. On the other hand, this bridge reveals a real commitment to the importance of language and linguistic practices perceived not only as information vehicles, but mainly as active agents of social processes and construction of identity. Furthermore, I will argue, and I agree too, that the narratives of the trauma experiences incorporated into the testimonies of miracles and occupying such a dominant place work as political tools rather than as a reflection of the reality. But before going further, it is necessary to describe briefly the historical context and to enumerate the reasons that transform a religious theological dispute into one of the main political conflicts in the 18th century France. Also, I must simplify a lot. It is important to present these key elements in order to understand the contribution of my research and its specificity. This is the story of the Jansenism, known as a spiritual Catholic movement. This is a story that began at the first half of the 17th century as a doctrinal question related to the grace. Gradually, it turned into a public tribune during the first half of the 18th century, a tribune that involved major actors of the institutional and political life in France's old regime. Conflicting relationships existed between, on the one side, the state of France the monarchy and the king, the parliament, the Gallican church, its episcopate and its lower clergy, its theologian doctors in the University of Paris, Sorbonne, and on the other side, the Catholic Church of Rome. Since its very beginning, Louis XIV, Louis the Sun, le Roi Soleil, perceived the Jansenism as a danger to absolute monarchy, and his suspicion and hostility lead to a strong alliance with the Church of Rome. Two major French institutions considered this alliance as a threat to the independence of the French state. The Gallican Church wanted to preserve its autonomy in inner ecclesiastical affairs of the Kingdom of France, and to remain independent vis-à-vis the Church of Rome. The Parliament of Paris that claimed for the authority of the state on temporal affairs estimated that the interferences of the Pope in intern religious affairs might lead to papal encroachment in temporal affairs as well. The king hoped to eradicate Jansenism with the help of papal condemnations, but this strategic coalition between the king of France and the Church of Rome aroused old fears, especially when the king asked the Pope to issue the order that we know as the Bull Unigenitus, and here it comes. Here it is. As a Bull Unigenitus. The Bull Unigenitus condemned officially Pasquier Quesnel's commentaries of the New Testament. This treatise was highly popular among French Catholic families, and it had been approved in 1696 by the Archbishop of Paris, Louis-Antoine de Noailles. Therefore, the Bull Unigenitus that transformed Quesnel's book into an heretical work provoked the anger and the rebellion among various individuals and groups all over France, including official instances in France that were not initially supporters of the Jansenist cause. Instead of erasing the movement, the papal constitution brought, on the contrary, to an unexpected regrouping of dissident forces supported by institutional instances as anti-constitutional bishops and advocates and magistrates of the parliament. This unusual political constellation created a pro-Jansenist climate that exacerbated the tension between the supporters and the adversaries of the Jansenism. So now you can understand why these testimonies have a very, very strong political impact. According to philosophers of the language, such as Michèle Bakhtin, to speak or to write participates in a constant process of evolution, shaping and reshaping given structures. It produces a dynamic interaction with known and shared categories. In other words, a two-way activity takes place. Also, pre-established generic patterns of the language determine our discourse. The social and communicative approach of the language is general and of the speech genres in particular considers that the act of witnessing has an impact on this very linguistic and social practice it belongs to, and in the same times plays a crucial role within social processes that form identity of both the witness and his addresses. And indeed, for the first time, anonymous voices occupy a central place in testimonies of miracle, especially as speakers, as subject of utterance, and the speech act becomes as important as the content of the witnessing itself. Seen in this angle, political issues of the testimony discourse are not just connected to exterior events, they are structured within the discourse itself and become a part of this event. To corroborate this assumption, I will present very shortly the deep gap that separates the testimonies of Saint Médard from the religious testimonies on miracles written during the 16th and 17th century. One can notice the didactic distinction the didactic dimension of the testimonies documents from the earlier times, while it is nearly inexistent in the later. This main difference reveals a deep cultural change that is connected to the identity of the witness and his position among the others. It shows also the major switch that occurs in the public arena in the 18th century and the birth of a public opinion. If we look at earlier testimonies, like couldn't put it in the computer, like this book, one of many other books, L'histoire des miracles faits par l'intercession de Notre-Dame de Montserrat. It is a 700-page book printed in Lyon, published in 1600, and dedicated to Henri IV. There we can see the predominance of the didactic message reflects, and this predominance of the didactic message reflects a very strong hierarchical conception of the society. Therefore, this is not a coincidence if the representatives of the official institutions of the state and the church are the speakers in this text from 1600. The first part of the book is composed of dedication to the king, signed by all the religious representatives of the convent, and a long introduction written by the Archbishop of Lyon, royal attestations and letters, and a long geographical and historical description of the holy place where the miracles occur. The second part of the book is composed of 382 short texts relating the miracles that occurred from the year 347 to the year 1586. The institutional framework guarantees the validity of the contents, and the miracles in this case serve one and unique task, the glorification of God and its official servants. The testimony of the miracle is given as a fact, and there is no need to convince, since the authorities gave their caution. Therefore, utterance traces are nearly inexistent in the testimonial discourse that is perceived as reporting the exact truth of the events. No direct speech, no subjective marks of the self, and no accent on the trauma experiences the subject goes through appear in these documents focused on the greatness of God. In short, we can see how these testimony discourses are elaborated by dominant groups, and in the perspective of social approach, one can say that the space of the miracle is circumscribed by the religious institution and its political and ideological power. Something totally different happens with the testimony of Saint-Médard, where the presence of the witnesses fills nearly totally the discursive space. The credibility of the witness is the main task, in the opposite of the former testimonies where the miracle were given as a proof. The turning upside down of the hierarchical order in the discourse reveals the implicit political targets of the testimonies of Saint-Médard. In the 18th century, the point is not to reinforce an existing power, but rather to give the opportunity to inaudible voices to be heard, and then to create a counter-power. And this is exactly what happens in this time with the Jansénistes. The long descriptions of the traumatic experiences are very significant. The exhibition of the vulnerability and the destructibility of the sick body means, beyond cultural and philosophical reasons that I don't have time here to describe, but that indeed exist, the description of the healed body means the will to convince, and the expressiveness of pain is connected to its immediate and strong effect on the audience on the one hand, and to the credibility earned by the account of physiological proofs on the other hand. This isn't This is not a coincidence that together with the exhibition of pains and suffering, the social and professional identity of the witness is presented with such many details. So the narrative schema changes as well and becomes more sophisticated, while the conditions of testimony accreditation accentuate the communicative situation. The instauration of an argumentative dialogue reflects the opening of new social spheres. In this perspective, the objective of the testimony is intrinsically connected to interactions with the others and interchange of speakers on the one hand, and to influences on the public opinion on the other hand. So to conclude, within the stormy climate of the first half of the Enlightenment, the testimonies of Saint Médard represent a turning point, not only in the perspective of history of religions, but also and even more in the perspective of literary and testimonial practices at this time. These testimonies mark out a change because they are innovative in terms of language and interactional exchanges. The new discursive strategies used reveal a deep evolution in the status of the witness and his position and relation he builds toward his own words. They indicate a beginning of recognition to something totally unknown at this time, conceptually talking, such as the consciousness of the self, emerging through the responses to physical catastrophes. The testimony isn't only the result of the narrated event, but on the contrary, it creates, modulates, and transforms this event. By doing so, testimony discourse convey wider issues than a transparent relation with a reliable narration of the facts. Thank you.
Okay, the floor is open, please.
Thank you. That is the fact that in classical age, the question, the main issue about testimony was not massacres or genocide, but miracles. It's important to say it. But I would like to go back to what you say about the pro-Jansenist climate. You talked about a very strong political impact of these testimonies and the counter powers of these testimonies. And about this point, I don't agree with you, because I am not sure that these testimonies convince other people, that people who were at this time already convinced. Maybe paper like Nouvelle Ecclésiastique succeeded to have a part of impact, but at its time it seems to me that what really was very important is to be able to create a public opinion, and some succeeded. For instance, Voltaire, writing the Treatise of Tolerance, was able to change the mind and to create a new public opinion about the status of Protestant. But it seems to me that the pro-Jansenist struggle was in fact a fight without tomorrow, because when you see the future of this debate, in fact, there was no future. So my question is, don't you think you overvalue this influence? Because when I read the great name of the great intellectual figures of this time, they have a judgment as, there are Jansenists on the side and pro-Molinists on the other side, and this is, they are all obscurantists, they are and it is not really what we can call a very strong influence.
Yes, thank you, Carol. I didn't mean to say that Janséniste and the testimony on this miracle of Saint-Médard are indeed very, very important for the history of France, or indeed very, very important for the different historical processes that happened toward the French Revolution. But what I wanted to say is that what I wanted to try to do is that I think that there is things that we should look at not as historian of the religions. That will, of course, tell us everything that happened exactly in this kind of constellation, and will give us all kind of examples, and then we'll bring the testimony of Saint-Médard as another fact that happened that made this and this and this. So exactly, I wanted to take this phenomenon and to try to see what it conveys inside, what it reflects as changes in testimonial practices, and how it reflects what others have called the change of the subject, or the movement from collective to individual, or the man alone without a word, in a world without God. So actually, it's interesting to see, in my point of view, how these testimonies are part of what we call of the fabrication of a public opinion. Not because they will have a real, concrete effect after that. Jansénists after that disappear. But it's obvious that it had played a very, very crucial role in France before the revolution. Yeah. The kingdom have been the institutions, the authorities of the institutions have been very much challenged by the Jansénists as much as by the enlightened philosophers, maybe not less. So even if it comes from reactionaries side. So that was my point of view. Yes, I think, of course, Saint-Médard is an event that occurred and finished. Yes.
I was wondering, one of the things you're talking very much about is the rise then of a public sphere.
Yes.
In early 18th century France. And I was thinking let's say in relation to Habermas's description of the rise of a public sphere in England, he's talking very much about some of the institutions and the ways in which information is discussed, and ways in which public opinion develops, for example, the coffee houses and places in which things are discussed. I know much more about the Jansénists in relation to Port-Royal and the kind of spreading of information from there, but I know nothing about the specific testimonies you were talking about. So I was wondering if you could talk more kind of institutionally. How were they read? Who read them? How many were published? What were the institutions? Were they discussed publicly? Was there a kind of at all public sphere emerging for them to be discussed, or was this something that was, very few people read them and just kind of privately? So I'd just be curious to hear more kind of culturally and institutionally.
I would be very happy to begin to tell you about all that, but as responsible of this conference, I think that some people will kill me if I begin to talk about the relationship of the Jansénists and the rising of the public opinion. But I will say very shortly that Carol spoke about the journal, the underground, the periodic Nouvelle Ecclésiastique, the Jansénists managed in the beginning of the 18th century to build a network which is very incredible. And they spread in a way, and we can see that through all the printed house and the people that were participating in this diffusion of the controversies and transforming it into something very open. I mean, we can see how a theological dispute becomes something that deal with democratization of the church, the desire going stronger and stronger from the lower clergy to have something to say about their work, and so on and so on and so on. Of course, and with this testimony particularly, we can say that the debate became much more popular. And the witnesses that were talking and were represented in these written testimonies, and you have hundreds of texts about that, are people coming from the populace. So all these ingredients make this story quite important and very interesting if we want to understand a little bit more what is public opinion and how it emerges. Yes. Yes.
Very, very simple question. You said that physical catastrophe give totally new consciousness of the self. Could you enlighten this a little more?
I didn't really say that. I say that maybe, no, okay. You can testify. You are written, and it's written here too. No, I just trying. Of course, concepts concepts sometimes come after things have been thought, but with other words and in other different ways. So when I saw this very extreme and strange, even obscene presence of the sick body, I mean, I don't have time here to give you examples, but I mean, it's described in a lot of details, what's going on with the body and with the blood splashing all over, and the sufferers, and all this it's very strange. And I was saying that this place of the sick body in these testimonies might be also connected to the importance of the self talking. And in a discursive space, but I will not go further with that because it's too long. But we can discuss about it. I mean, it's complicated. It's a suggestion. I think it's something that we have to go with, especially that I was trying to link this with traumatic. I think it's a traumatic experience, but it is not perceived always as a traumatic experience. But the presence is so strong that we have to take it and to think about it.
We become aroused when we hear blood. And not just a comment, it's not a question. Maybe this rich description of injuries of the body are foreshadowing or heralding a new theology. It's the theology of the revolution and the Napoleonic Wars that were basically about injuring bodies.
Okay. Yes.
This description of the body, isn't it an ancient rhetorical figure actually of the evidentia, of describing like a tableau what the audience should see in their imagination? So is this actually an ancient figure?
It is. That's why, I mean, of course it is, but there are different things that happen. I mean, practices are different, and that's why I'm asking what have changed. And that's why also I try very shortly to make this comparison between testimonies with a former testimony from pre-modern time with the testimonies of Saint Médard. I mean, they are talking about, of course, about the body, the suffering body. Jesus is a suffering body. It is obvious. But what's changed there in this testimony, I think, is that the perspective is different. I mean, the description is coming from the subject and not from outside. That's what I tried to say, you see. It is not like we are telling about miracles, but it is the utterance framework is not the authorities, but it is the within, yeah. So this is very, very different. And about Napoleon, I don't know. I don't know. We have to talk. I didn't really understand what you say.
Said that it is foreshadowing.
Foreshadowing.
A new religion.
The religion
a
of
new theology. The theology of the revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, the nation-state ideology, and this is a religion of murder.
I don't agree. I will say, without thinking so much, but really fast, I would say I don't agree with you, because for me, what happened with these Jansenists is very connected to the Enlightenment. Even if they are anti-Enlightenment, it's very connected to the Enlightenment. It's a part of something that is going on and transforming France. And for me, Enlightenment is not murder. For me, Enlightenment is something, and it's not only pain and suffering. On the contrary, for me, Enlightenment is something very optimistic. And even so. I don't like Napoleon, personally. I don't like Napoleon. I like to speak about things that I like. Things that I don't like, I prefer to let the other.
I know that what I want to ask you is very far away, but the last time that I heard about the miracles of Saint Médard was at school, many years ago. But still, this conjunction of folklore faith, of healing, and you have emphasized at the beginning the body and its vicissitudes. And the power of the church, does it not lead to Lourdes and all that kind? I mean, as a undercurrent. But maybe that I entirely.
You speak about the miracles?
Yes, and also that kind of.
Yeah, I'm not an historian of the religion. I know only about Jansenists, and it's because they are crazy that I like them. Of course, but miracles had happened all the time, and we have to remember that, as I say, it's a tradition in the Christianity to speak, to tell, to believe on miracles. And this is one story in a very long tradition of miracles and testimonies of miracles. But I think that something changed, and has something to do and can help us to understand an evolution in testimonial practices connected, of course, with the witness and with his position when he talks, and with his words. So that's what is, in my point of view, very interesting. I mean, it's much more and much beyond the phenomenon of miracles in the Christianity history, much more beyond the question of the impact of religion on the French Revolution. And it is very connected to this cultural and ideological evolution that occurred in the 17th and 18th century. So that's why I don't know about Lourdes so much.
Just a short comment. I thought that it might be an interesting comparison today with truth commissions or refugee testimonies, when the institution is now taking over the subject in certain ways, constructing, constituting, teaching them to speak in certain ways about subjective suffering. For instance, Kelly McKinney has an interesting paper about how torture victims are taught to convince committees that they are in fact torture victims so that they can receive citizenship. So here you have a reversal of what you're talking about, this shift from the institutional to the subject. It seems as if today you have something going back into the other direction in a more subtle way.
Yes, I think it's very interesting, and I think, of course, it's linked in the very wide perspective. We see changes, but everything is connected to authorities.
Yes.
And that's why I think that it is something connected with counterpower. Also, it hadn't been a real counterpower. It is connected to institutions. Yes. Okay.
May I say something to ask you? Just to follow up on Judd's comment, which sounded initially far-fetched maybe, but when we take it seriously, then we may say the following. Every movement has the capacity to self-infect itself with its own side effects. So even the Enlightenment infected itself with terror, and the religion of Enlightenment brought about terror after the French Revolution. Now, I'm sure that we cannot go from your presentation to the terror of the French Revolution or following the French Revolution, because we are not sure that there is a public domain that carried these images through. But what you said, that images, these kind of images, have the capacity to transform and create and modulate our consciousness, these kind of images can self-infect the consciousness of those who brought them about in the first place to release the subject as an individual. What would you say to that?
Yes, I will. There is a lot of things to say. I'm happy that these questions are asked. I think that even though I'm talking about the 18th century, we have a lot of things to think about in order to understand what happened today. The only thing that I will react to very, very strongly is that the terror of the revolution is not connected to the Enlightenment philosophy, but might be connected to other things. I mean, that's okay, but it is another subject.
Okay, thank you. Let's conclude this session, and thank you, the audience and the presenters.